Welcome to Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hello, Matthew.
Hey, Carl.
Episode 8.
Here we are.
We're kind of closing in on the end. It's been a journey we've been having.
Yeah. An enjoyable one, if I may say.
I think so. I hope other people think so. Hopefully it's worthwhile and useful. So since we are 8 episodes in, why don't you take a moment and see if you can kind of set out where we are?
Just pause and look back and regroup. I think there's broadly maybe 4 kind of large ideas that we've kind of been covering. The first, I would say, is a premise that we're in peril or we have some problems. You know, I think statistically the numbers bear that out. I think anybody listening, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, your empirical evidence, your lived experience kind of says, hey, we're not in a great spot.
And we meaning the nation, the United States.
Meaning the U.S., yes.
Yeah.
Second point would be that, again, broadly speaking, there's kind of 2 opposing camps, and each of them wants to fight to fix the problem. One is conservatives / Christian conservatives.
Yep.
Again, broad strokes here, but I think it gets accomplishes what we need here. And the other we would put under the kind of the heading of progressive.
Right.
That whole school of thought that emerged when it did.
They both see the peril. So they agree with the first point.
They agree.
Yeah, they both say, there's a problem.
Yes.
And they even will talk in terms of an existential, so life-threatening. Like all of society will collapse. Like our future for our children is horrific if we don't fix it. So they're all in that same ballpark.
Yep.
And they deeply disagree on the solution and who's to blame and those kinds of things.
Yes. Classical human interaction, sometimes we agree on facts and disagree strongly on meaning.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, good.
And then the third broad point that we've been covering is that you are arguing, and we're exploring the idea that the reason for these troubles is we have forgotten our past. We have kind of forgotten where we came from. We've forgotten the lessons that have been learned, and we've gotten ourselves in a bad spot and have basically become detached or unmoored from our history, from our roots.
Yeah,
roots that might steer us in the right direction.
Yeah, that historical forgetfulness is a key part. And again, if we're currently in peril, one could say, has the country always been in peril? Mm-hmm. The evidence is no. Hasn't been perfect, of course, but previously, looking back, say post this moment, you say, "Oh, things were good, and the country was a country people wanted to move to, and people thought it was a positive, and we were setting the trend for other nations, et cetera, et cetera." So it would suggest that something's been lost.
Yes,
something's changed along the way, and so then the point being in the title, it's America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness. Right, so we don't lose, and when we've looked at some ancient resources, we've talked about Tolkien along the way, and again when you see these, there's a common trend or common statement of, well, you're in this spot because you have failed to remember your history. So we're saying this is true for us as the United States.
Yes, and the troubles it goes across the board: economic, social, justice, you name it.
Yep.
But the premise that we have been, again, exploring, point number 4 here, is that the heart of all of these issues are actually of a spiritual nature.
Yeah, it's interior. It's an interior, and we can't be afraid. In fact, I was just in a conversation, which I won't elaborate the who, and this came up, and there was almost an immediate pushback, not in revulsion, but just kind of like, "Oh, I don't know if I want to talk about that." And I'm like, you have to. We literally have to, because this is kind of at the root of the issue, that there is something going on interior.
Yeah, and nothing corrects itself in my experience.
Yeah.
So and
some of that And again, we're saying interior and spiritual because of the type of foundation that was formed. Now, we've not really dug into that. That's where we're going. This episode, the next, and the next are kind of going to look at core founding things, including the Declaration of Independence. That's next episode. And then the Constitution coming up after that, and state constitutions, to kind of see what's there. But that the foundation of the system of government, which we alluded to back in episode 1 and I think episode 2, about it being a unique style, a citizen civic government of the people without a power on top making us, no police officer on every corner to force you to stop at stop signs, was dependent and is dependent upon some sort of a common moral virtue that is of a spiritual nature. And so what we've been looking at is, and what we're going to really dig in today, is that who brings that to us? Where's that come from?
Yeah. And again, this has been touched on many times before, but when we say that the root of all these problems are of spiritual nature, we are not driving towards a closing argument of everybody in our country needs to become a Christian.
Absolutely.
Which I think we've covered off on, but it's anybody who's maybe just joining us right now, that's not where we're going with this. So just unclench and enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, we just want to look at the evidence. Again, as I just said a second ago, if things have gotten bad, what was positive before doesn't mean we're going to go back to something. And again, so the rest of the title, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back, is back to safety, not back in time to something. We want to find a safe harbor, and that can be ahead. So what that looks like, well, we're not even really going to, I'm not prepared to propose this X is the solution by some religion or something, but I am going to say, and what we have been arguing, is that there needs to be that common foundation. The system we have does not work without that common foundation. So we got to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
okay. So today we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of English colonization in North America. Now, my good history students and listeners will say, but there were Europeans here before. Yes, there were. And those Europeans in places like modern-day Texas, modern-day Louisiana, modern-day Florida were not English. Absolutely. There's a longer story there, which we don't have time to get into. We're not dismissing them or our French friends to the north or our Dutch and Swedish colonists in the middle of the country in modern-day Delaware, New Jersey, New York. We're not dismissing them. But the short version is England wins. England wins this geopolitical contest that includes North and South America. And for North America, England becomes the dominant victor coming out of a series of wars involving France and Spain. Or as I tell my students, we speak English. The Spanish were here first. We should be speaking Spanish. That we don't is a cute little hint that the winner of that contest was not Spain, but England.
Right.
So then we're saying what becomes the United States at its initial start, while there were other Europeans involved, it's all England. So we'll say, well, what did they do? And then are there lessons that we can glean from what they did? There may not be, but there may be. And so going back to the two characters that we've positioned, right, and just kind of saying in a broad statement, if the Christian nationalist, if the conservative who thinks we need a stronger Christian presence in government are accurate, well, is that what we find in the early colonies? Were they all coming and saying we're establishing a Christian nation? Or if the more progressive side who thinks Christianity needs to be curtailed and for some maybe even eliminated as it itself being the reason for the negative flourishing. The lack of flourishing is because of Christianity. And there are many people who I personally know of and have or heard who would make that argument. That it's the negative, right? So it should be removed. It's like, so is that the story that the founding colonists came with no Christianity and or no religion whatsoever, and then later, maybe like in the time of the Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s, was Christianity imposed in on the country, right? So, okay, well, let's see what we can find, because let's just see. We can learn our lessons. And this is, for me, is one of the most important aspects of doing good historical work. I don't bring my own opinions into the story. I certainly don't bring my modern morals, virtues, mores in. What's the story as I find it, as I'm there? And then I want to look and see what do I glean about what they did. And I don't have to like or dislike what they did, but I need to accept, I need to honor to some degree. That's what they did.
Yeah.
And then we go from there.
I like it.
All right. So there are 4 early colonies that occur. Now you have to put all this in reference point to what's happening in England. This is 17th century, so 1600s. Mm-hmm. Queen Elizabeth died. She's turned the crown over to her family. And one way that people examine American colonization is that in the 1640s, there's a civil war that breaks out in England. It leads to a 20-year window, or roughly 20 years, of their own attempt at government without a king. And then in 1660, the monarchy is restored. And when you study British history, this is called the Restoration, right? So there's the colonies that happened before the Civil War. Then there's what they're often called the Restoration colonies. So we're not going to look at the Restoration colonies. There's other things that could be gleaned from them. In fact, I recently was just in Charlestown, if you want to go back in time, in Charleston, South Carolina, and that's a Restoration colony. So there's things that can be understood about the larger story of the United States, about from colonization that we could. But we're not looking. We want to say what happened in the first 4, because they set the trend. Having said that, let me restate for myself. There are more lessons about the United States and that we can glean from the colonization that does involve all of the colonies. And when you then bring in to say what was happening in Florida and St. Augustine or Pensacola or over in Louisiana or Texas, and you bring in what's happening coming down the Mississippi from France, all that provides us a wonderful tapestry. It's an important tapestry. But we're going to zone in on these 4 because of the nature of the questions that we're asking. Like, what was unique about the foundation? That interior thing you mentioned earlier, the spiritual nature. Is there evidence for or against? And what can we take away from there? So we're kind of looking at those 4. All right? Is that good?
I like it. Let's do it.
All right, let's go in order. All right. Now, Matthew, you have graduated from USA schools.
Yes.
I won't name the school. I'll leave it alone.
Yeah, let's not throw them under the bus. This might not go good.
I do know the name. So Jamestown, is our first colony. Technically, it's our second colony. There was the lost colony of Roanoke, but they got lost, so they don't help us. So Jamestown.
Yes.
So tell me, what's something you know about the Jamestown colony?
All right. This is something I know from 7th grade. And not my 7th grade, when my kids were in 7th grade.
There it is.
So it still counts.
It does.
So first permanent English colony.
Yep.
And the first group that came over is just dudes. And I'm like, oof, that's a pass. That's a lot of fist fights, I would guess.
Yep.
Didn't go really well. And then, beyond that, it gets a little murky for me. Something about malaria and fires and moving to a new location.
Yeah.
Smart. Get off of the water.
There we go.
But you visited there.
You recently visited.
Yeah, within the last couple of years. And it's very, you're like, wow, okay, this is great. I can't imagine being out here in the freezing cold.
Yes.
With no real plan for food and it's a grim bit of business being an explorer.
Do you know why they came? Could you tell me
Well,
why
I'm sure
they
they
came?
told me, but I was hoping to get by with just
short answer is money.
Money.
They wanted to make money.
I can respect that.
So again, this is a short answer. There's obviously, hopefully, as you know this, my listeners, there's always deeper to go, and I encourage you to dig deeper in. Hope you go visit some of these places we're about to mention.
Gold.
Yeah. The British had seen what had happened for mostly for Spain. And of course, if you know anything about the British Navy, it was basically not begun, but to some degree, you could say it's begun by pirates. Pirates on who? On the Spanish. Doing what? Bringing gold. You've all seen Pirates of the Caribbean. You know Jack Black. What are they doing? There's that gold. There's that gold that's cursed and whatever. So everybody in Europe's like, whoa, this is kind of cool. It's been roughly 50 to 70 years since that gold started flowing in. Everybody's like, I want in on that. It's kind of like crypto today or something. Everybody's like, maybe I should get in on this. It's kind of cool. So they're interested. And so this company, the Virginia company, says, we can make this happen. They discover there's no gold there. And so then they're kind of stuck. So they're trying to figure it out. Now, I just want to stop there to say, so our very first colony gives us what I call one of the 4 founding themes of America, and that is capitalism. Now, by the way, these 4 founding themes, once I get them all out in front of you, you can reject them all. You can say, that's not me. I don't like that. I disagree with that. Totally cool. But there's still the DNA of what it means for this country to exist and to some degree to be a citizen here. It's in your DNA, whether you like it or not. It's just in the mix of this country. And so right out the gate, these dudes were all coming to make some cash. They were almost all nobles or upper class people. There were some maybe poorer people. The story of the peasants coming over, indentured servants coming over, that's later. Right off the bat, they're coming to make some money. And as you noted, they were all men. They were all male. Now, this then leads us to the 2 big takeaways that I want us to look at for Jamestown. Because they were all upperclassmen, they ran into the problem of realizing once there's no gold, we have to survive. And they figure out that survival is very difficult. And it takes somebody actually planting food in the ground. It takes somebody going on the hunting parties to find the deer and the game. It takes somebody defending the walls and obviously the interactions with the native peoples. In Jamestown, it was not a positive experience, right? And none of them wanted to do it because they were the upper crust. They were comfortable in ease, which we've been saying is a problem for our country today. That's actually a side point. But the interesting part is, hopefully you have heard of James Smith.
Yes.
You've at least seen the Disney movie Pocahontas.
Have not seen that movie.
Oh, you haven't?
I know. I have 4 children. Have still never watched that one.
Yeah.
But I do know.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a little bit about him.
It's a poor history reflection. So just so you know, you can watch it for the wonderful music and obviously the great artwork and the story Disney tells. It's not all that accurate.
But much less singing in the real history.
In the real history, there was probably no singing.
Yeah.
There might have been a little singing. James Smith comes back and a year after they kind of got there and cracked the whip.
Yeah.
And he basically put in motion no work if there's no work, there's no food.
Yeah.
You don't get to eat. And it's a dictatorial thing. So right there is another side clue for us, is that they weren't coming and establishing democracy. They weren't coming and establishing government for all. They were coming to make some money. And then at the same time, they were all, most of them, pretty comfortable, and they didn't really want to put the effort in until somebody came and made them. So that's a counterpoint for this idea of, oh, America was a land of democracy or the land of the average person. It's like, no, it wasn't. The second thing was that you noted that they were only men. So again, what's happening? It's like a company. So imagine we're going to go to Mars one day, right? You can imagine the governments of various nations will send rockets to establish colonies, but you can also imagine a real wealthy company like Amazon or Apple or Mercedes-Benz or IKEA or somebody will say, we're going to send a rocket up there. And so why would they do that? Well, they would want to go make money. They would hope that there's something on Mars or whatever planet we're going to that could be beneficial to them as a company. We're funding it. We're going to resource it. We're going to make some money. And that's this Virginia company. They had stockholders. We're going to make some money, right? And they're not really making any money. And you go forward a decade plus, and they're struggling because not only are people dying because the Europeans are not well suited yet for the environment, there's just men there. And so finally, in a radical move, they decided we actually need community. We'll only survive together. So now throw your mind back to episode 1 when I told you we had 3 problems. And one of those is this growth of hyper-individuality that has occurred in our time. And the myth that comes along with it of rugged individualism, America was founded by individuals and these rugged individuals all by themselves. And I told you then it wasn't true. So this is the first evidence of this. Here you have this colony. They're in a fort. They're trying to build a whole society. They've been there for a decade. Where were you a decade ago? So it's a long time, right? Yeah. A decade they're going. They can't make it work out. So finally what they did in 1619, which if some of you will know, that's another important year for some of the things in the colony that happened that aren't necessarily good. But it's interesting here. They send basically a promotion advertising in the newspaper. It comes forth as a letter saying that we need a fit 100th might be sent of women. They need 100 women, maids young and uncorrupt, to make wives to the inhabitants, and by that means to make the men more settled and less movable.
This is proto-Tinder.
Yes. They basically ask women in England to take the incredible risk to move to the New World for the entire purpose of marrying somebody you didn't know to form a family.
Some brave gals.
It was. They got 90 out of, they wanted 100. They got 90.
Impressive.
And when you do the research there, the future of the Virginia colony, the Jamestown location, never in doubt. They reported in 1622 that they have 57 young maids have been made wives to the planters, divers of which were well married before the coming away of the ships. Basically, families were established. So a couple of key lessons for Jamestown. One, they came for the money. They were not interested in democracy. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying it's what it is.
Yeah.
And they realized that the individual story doesn't work. And you can say, well, they were still a group of guys. Yes. And what did they survive on? The family. Now, this is going to be controversial for some people. We're not going to get stuck here. I'm just going to say it and move on. Historically, society is always founded around family. Father, mother, children. It's always that. Whatever race we're talking about, whatever continent we're talking about, whatever tribal group we're talking about, whatever religion they believed in, this is not a singular religious viewpoint. This is a global viewpoint. All societies, all civilizations are around the family. Male, female, father, mother, child. And in Virginia, they almost lost the colony. They weren't making it happen until they asked for women to come, and they had these brave women who came over by themselves. And I know that's tough for some people to think about, but that's what it is. That's our lesson there.
Yeah.
Let's go north.
All right.
All right. This is maybe the most famous of the colonies, the Pilgrims. You got anything from 7th grade on the Pilgrims?
Listen, it gets even a little fuzzier from here forward. Yeah.
You're not the only one.
Yeah.
I mean, after Jamestown, everybody's kind of like, and then we were the United States.
Yeah. Pilgrims kind of gets conflated with the other guys.
We're going to get to them.
Yep. Who we'll get to. Buckles on hats and Thanksgiving, yada, yada. It's, and not to mention the fourth people you're going to talk about who I've never even heard of. But yes, for right now.
Yep.
Yeah. Plymouth Rock, funny clothes.
Plymouth Rock, yeah. It's actually a very small rock when you go see it.
Yeah.
It's not very big.
Not the best tourist attraction ever.
It's not what you're thinking. Yeah. Huh. You go looking for it and you're kind of like, oh, okay. I think I got sold a bad bill. Disney did this.
It'd be a
Disney
World.
It'd be a lot
Where's
nicer.
the gift shop?
Exactly. All right, so when you do a little English history, so I told you 1600s, Civil War in the middle part of it. Reverse, backwards to the early 1500s. In Europe, a revolution occurs in religion. We call it the Reformation. In England, the Reformation's a whole, it's a whole other story I could kind of get us into. But the short version is England did not get into the Reformation for the reasons Martin Luther and the other names you may know of from Central Europe got into the Reformation. Loosely, you could say those people, Martin Luther, Wycliffe, Calvin, Melanchthon, they're thinking in terms of theological discussion and debate about things in the Bible. England's not on that story. In fact, they were happily opposed to the Reformation until the very famous King Henry VIII decided he needed to have a son, and his current wife was not able to pull that off. And so he asked permission from the Pope to get a divorce. The Pope said no. There's a wonderful geopolitical story as to why this happens. He says no, but the long story short is it is a geopolitical thing, not a religious thing, that the Pope says no. And the king says, okay, I'll do it anyway. And so basically England, far from Rome, on a little island, they're like, we're just going to do our own thing. And so they do. Now, this then leads in England to 25 years of some tension. There's not religious wars, but there's tension because, you've had a certain thing a certain way for a long time. And out of nowhere, the king says like, yeah, we're going to do something different. And so then it's like, well, what does different mean? And different people start being involved to try to work it out. Okay, so the tension gets messy to the point that one of the king's daughters, Mary, takes the throne, and she's determined to return England back to the fold of the original Christian faith. This is, by the way, the time when you start talking about the Roman Catholic Church. Previous to that, you would not have used that phrase. It just was Christianity, the Christians, that kind of a thing. And so she's determined to return them back to the fold. And she will at times use persecution. This fact that she uses persecution but then ultimately loses, remember, history is written by the victors, right? is why she gets the moniker of Bloody Mary, from which we get the drink, the Bloody Mary. And so some people did not want to take the risk, and they fled England, and they went into Central Europe, specifically into Switzerland, where you could say by this point the heartbeat of the Reformation is taking place, mostly around Geneva and mostly around John Calvin. All right, so we good so far?
Yeah.
Okay. When she dies, her sister Elizabeth, who I mentioned a minute ago, comes to the throne. Her sister Elizabeth does not want the tension. To some degree, you could even arguably say she didn't care, didn't have an opinion. That's not trying to say she wasn't a Christian or didn't, but anyway, she didn't really care. She just didn't want the tension civically. So she basically said, I'm going to do what my dad did. I'm not going to go back to where my sister was because that's going to be too controversial. But if I just go back to where my dad is, the dust will settle. And to some degree, what Anglican faith becomes, certainly at that point, is, I jokingly call it Catholic light. It's everything Catholic without the Pope. It's basically everything you think of. Go to an Anglican service or an Episcopalian service, then go to Catholic Mass on the same day in your town, and you'll see very little difference. There's some, but you'll see very little difference. I know it's more nuanced than that, and hopefully I'm not trying to offend anybody who's of those faith positions. All right, when she comes back to the throne, these guys in England who had fled for their lives come back home. All that ultimately leads then to this place where there's debate in England as to how much reform do we want in our faith, of which probably the bulk of folks in England were like, I don't care. I don't really want that much. I don't want that much turmoil. But so people come back in, and as you get in the latter part of the 1500s, so last part of Queen Elizabeth's reign, and then into this first part where we've changed hands to her cousins, the Stuarts. James I is on the throne at first, which is why Jamestown is called Jamestown. And so you get to that point. There now are groups in England who are frustrated, and they're asking questions, wanting to make changes. These groups splinter into at least two categories. One category says, we don't think we can make changes here, so we need to leave. These groups are typically known as the separatist. Sometimes they'll be called independents, but usually separatist. This is the group that we call the Pilgrims.
Okay.
Now, the Pilgrims that we know in New England are not the only separatists. There are a lot of people. And basically, they're just like, you know what? We're never going to fix things here in England. Nobody's going to listen to us. Nobody wants to make the changes we're going to make. So we're just going to get out. And they did. Some of them got out by going into kind of isolation within England itself. And then some moved to other places where there would be nobody around them. Some went to other places on the continent. The group that we call the Pilgrims, which, by the way, that's not what they called themselves, think of that as a church. So think of, if you go to church or go to synagogue, and you could probably name or identify, particularly if you're in a normal-sized one here in the United States, so somewhere between maybe 50 to 150 people or 200 people, you could probably identify at the local grocery store everybody in your church. You know them. That's you're with me. You're in my group. Right? That whole group hopping in a boat and getting out. And they did. They went to the Netherlands, and the Netherlands was a place they thought would be safe for them to pull this off. There wasn't really open persecution in England for having the wrong faith. However, this is that time when a land that we would call a nation today, a civic entity within a geographic space, would have a single faith position, and everybody had to obey it. And if you didn't, they just didn't go, okay, it's fine, you didn't come to church today. They noticed. And there was a sense in which, particularly if you took an alternative stance of some kind, that you'd get in trouble. So they're like, we don't want to go through that. We think there should be some massive changes in England, but nobody wants to listen to us. So we want to separate. We're getting out. And so they did. But while they were in the Netherlands, after about a year, they're kind of like, we think the culture here is negatively influencing our children. So they're like, this isn't good enough. We need to go somewhere else. And so this is 18, 19, 20. And so right in that same time period, as I just told you, the Virginia company is saying, we need some women. Word is kind of in England now, 2 decades in, that we've got this thriving place. They still knew of other places in North America. And they're like, oh, well, maybe we should consider this. So long story short, this small congregation F-U-N-D, funds a boat to send a group of them over as kind of like an advance team to go. They couldn't all afford to go. Like their lead pastor couldn't afford to go, or he chose not to go, at least not initially. He'll come over later. And they take off. But to fund it, they're going to allow other people on board who are also thinking, well, we could go live here. Now, what they thought they were going to do was just go a little north of the Virginia Company. So we would say probably they'd land in what we today call Maryland or maybe Pennsylvania or something like that. That's not where they land. They end up going much further north into what we today call New England and Massachusetts is where it's at. So they famously come over on this boat called the Mayflower. All right, you with me so far?
I am with you.
Okay. When they came over and found that they weren't in the right spot, there was some discussion on the boat. So imagine you're on the boat, you found land, you're not building the colony yet. You're like, what are we about to do? And they're like realizing this is not exactly where we said we would be. And so there was some debate about, well, how do we structure ourselves for success? And this is really crucial to get that the majority of people, roughly 60, are not of this church. They're not of this separatist group that we call the Pilgrims, right? So they're on the boat together, needing to talk their way through what are we going to do. And they famously will conclude before they get off the boat, we need to write a new agreement because the old one was with the Virginia Company, and now we're not even nowhere near those guys. So we need to come to something else. So they say, okay, we're going to do that. And this is what we famously know as the Mayflower Compact. So we want to look at, I'm going to ask you to read. It's a little tricky. So, if you get lost in some of the fancy words there, I'll help you out there. But we're going to read through. It's really short. So everybody pay attention. Feel free to Google it, or it's in the show notes if you want to see, you want to click the link to go to see it online.
All right, here we go. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God. Okay,
skip the next. There's like 3 lines of titles for King James.
Very
you can
fancy.
Skip all that down to pick up where do by these, I think, or something like that.
All right. Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and the honor, with a U, of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience.
All right, you got it. And then it stops there at the end with the witness. And if you go online, if you look at it online, you can see the signers of this bad boy. All right, so what we want to do is say, what did the Pilgrims and everybody on the Mayflower, what were they saying? Right? So right out the gate, what's the first thing? Loyalty to the monarch. Right? They say right at the very beginning, this is in loyal sovereign to King James. I think this is really important because, again, some of these lessons are at the larger level that I'm trying to point out here, that there was no thought, at least amongst the Pilgrims, and certainly none amongst the folks in Jamestown, that they were going to establish a nation at all. So anybody want to say Christian nation? Well, clearly not with these guys, because they're not even trying to establish a nation. They are trying to establish a place for their own locale where they think they can operate in a way that they wish, but they're doing it not in a sense of saying we are leaving England or leaving the king. What are they created for? The glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. Okay, so now these guys are saying, hey, we believe this. This is important for us. Again, remind yourself, you got 60 of the 100 or so that are not part of this group.
Not on board with this, which is interesting.
Yeah. Now, would each of those people probably have made some agreement to their long-standing Christian history? Yeah, sure. But they're not this group of Pilgrims. So anybody who wants to point to the Pilgrims and say, yeah, see that first colony in Plymouth, that's the one that's a Christian nation. It's like, well, no, clearly not, even though they're acknowledging. So it's both the Christian aspect as well as the not a Christian nation. they're going to do governance together. So whereas in Jamestown, we saw very little evidence of any kind of like a democracy or government of the people. Here you do have one. They say we're going to covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. So we're going to work together. So again, now who's saying we're going to work together? The Christian, the hyper-Christian, the conservative Christian, and the person who's not. We're going to do it together. It's not we Christians are going to do this, or the majority, those people who aren't Christians, are going to do this. It's like, no, we're going to work out together. And what are they going to do? They're designing it to structure society for a justice to happen, to do it well, for it to be flourishing, right? So they say for our better ordering and preservation, and then how enact such just and equal laws as you just read. And then probably the fifth thing, although I've already alluded to it, is that we get a very clear early statement of what we would today call religious tolerance. Now, I press my students, and we'll show you this more with our next group. I think it's not healthy or helpful, I should say, to say religious tolerance is why people came to North America from England. They weren't. They were coming for Christian freedom of expression. And then we're going to see us move into a moment where they recognize later that there's other people here with different ideas. But the Pilgrims are seeing this. So they are deciding we're going to do this government together. Wouldn't call it a democracy, but a kind of a government of the people, elections of the people. They'll choose from their own group who can be in this group. And we're going to kind of do it together with this other group. They called the other group the strangers, meaning they're not part of our church. We don't know them. And they're going to include a variety of viewpoints in the story. So if Jamestown gives us one of our four themes, which is capitalism, the Pilgrims gives us our second, Christianity. I would suggest that capitalism and Christianity are the two biggest important of the four. The other two I'm going to introduce maybe at the very end because they don't come out necessarily. Well, anyway, they're vital. And there's a whole longer conversation I won't go into now, but I think when people ask about, say, the excesses of capitalism, which is greed-based, it's me, more me, what's a counterbalance? Well, there's lots of possible counterbalances, but in our early country, the counterbalance was Christianity, which is moderation. And we talked about this, and this is where we could arguably say Christians and Christianity itself in this country in the 21st century has failed because it isn't playing that role, because we see that same level of maybe greed and excess within them. But when you can see it in a kind of an academic way, you can say, oh, so you have Jamestown, which is more, get more. And you have the Pilgrims who are coming for a quiet expression of just their little lives, able to express themselves in a spiritual way on their own. You put those two together and you get a perfect balance on the teeter-totter. I think it's cool.
I like it.
Okay. Third group. This is the more famous group, and often, in my opinion, the Pilgrims get subsumed into this group.
Right.
And you can find online, and I will say to anybody who goes and looks, you will find probably far more famous historians than I disagreeing with me. But I'm going to stand my ground because I think the evidence is on my side. So when I left you off, I told you, we were talking about England, we talked about the fact that people came back with Queen Elizabeth, and they came back from Europe with this more, shall we say, aggressive understanding of Christianity or reform Christianity, the reformers, the protesters, the Protestants. And when they got to England, Queen Elizabeth's like, yeah, we're not going down that road. Well, the one group, the separatists, said, okay, fine, we're just going to go do it ourselves on our own. Nobody has to copy us, whatever. But there was another group who came back and they said, no, we're going to fight you. And we're going to demand this movement to what they believed would better purify the country. This purification, this incorporation of more, in their opinion, more accurate understandings of what the Bible asks for from Christians. Their critics soon used that as a nickname, and that's our Puritans. It was meant initially in a derogatory term, and the Puritans eventually take it as a badge of honor and say, yeah, you know what? Absolutely. We're not leaving. We're going to stay here because we need to purify this story. This is my home. I'm staying whether you like it or not. Nice. So that's the group. So from the time of the end of the 1500s, so Queen Elizabeth's last couple decades, the Puritans as a larger group will strive, fight, and to some degree, you could even say the Civil War in the 1640s begins at least partially because of the Puritans pushing the issues that they're pushing. There's more to it than that for the English Civil War in 1642. But you could have this Puritan aspect in the story. And so when they're coming, they're determined to fight. So they're going to fight. Okay? So you got this idea. They're in England. However, within the Puritans themselves, there were some groups that while they were not afraid to fight, thought perhaps if they could just build a model somewhere to demonstrate the point they're making about how the civic structure would work best based around Puritan ideas, that could then help the effort to save, quote unquote, England.
Interesting.
So they say, you know what we'll do is we will sail to the New World and establish our own colony. We'll make it a new England, in which case we can model for everybody else. And now, unlike Jamestown, which was, it was well funded, but still it was not all that much. And of course, the Pilgrims coming over on their own little kind of leaky boat. These guys put together some money. The sources are mixed. There's somewhere between, I've seen 4 ships, I've seen 17 ships, I've seen 11 ships.
Oh.
But they came over in a fleet.
Okay.
They came over with somewhere between 700 and 1,100 colonists. So we're not talking about 40 people. We're not talking about 100 people trying to make their way out in Jamestown.
No all men.
Yeah, no. This is families.
This is
we're
for
all
real.
in. Yeah, we're coming.
Yeah.
We're coming to do this thing. And the person who was put in charge is a man named John Winthrop. So he's one of the spiritual leaders. He's not like, again, we're not talking about one church now. This is not one mega church. This is a group of, we're going to go build a model. We're going to show everybody. And again, their hopes are everybody back in England will see the wisdom of what they're doing. Oh, we could do this here. That's what they're going to try and do. So they're going to take off and do this. And this is often called by Puritan historians of the time, the Great Migration. So we're going to go make this big move and kind of go over. Before long, there'll be thousands of Puritans coming over all the way up into the Civil War. In fact, through the Civil War, there will be Puritans who decide they don't like some of the direction things are going in, so they'll come over to the New World to live there in the New England. And again, eventually their success in numbers will swallow up the Pilgrims. We lose the Pilgrims. And to me, this is one of the reasons why the Pilgrims are often considered a version of Puritans. Again, there's a longer story here, a longer debate within historical sources of what is actually happening in England. But again, for me, there's the core, there's the Anglicans, there's the remnant of before the Catholics, and then post Mary, so with Elizabeth, you have this at least 2 strands. There actually ends up being 3 or 4 strands of groups who come back into England saying Anglicanism, not enough. And the one group says, you know what, we're not going to fight this fight. We're going to separate, go our own separate way. You guys do what you do. We're going to do what we're going to do. They are separate. They're different from the Puritans. The Puritans are the group saying, no, we're going to purify things. We're going to make it happen. So when they get to New England, they don't intentionally try to sail to where the Pilgrims are. But unfortunately for the Pilgrims, they basically land on their back door.
Wow.
They're in the same basic ballpark. And so when they're there, Winthrop gives a sermon. So he's kind of, imagine, again, obviously if there's multiple ships, it's kind of hard to see how he pulled this off, and maybe he went from ship to ship. But he basically gives a famous sermon. So this kind of gives us, like the Mayflower Compact, gives us kind of a direction to kind of say, okay, well, what's in the mix here? And so this is where we get the very famous phrase that becomes core in American political history of City on a Hill, which actually comes from the Bible, but that's a different point. And so he begins by laying out in his, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, it's kind of long, by establishing the nature of human existence, that God's in control and everything kind of happens for a reason. And he lays out the crucial point, which becomes a central thing. So this will be the 3rd straight colony where we've heard this, where everybody needs each other. So the Pilgrims said it, Jamestown discovered it late, not individual, community. Then he gives this long section where he says, this duty of mercy is exercised in 3 kinds: giving, lending, and forgiving. And he kind of goes into a typical, if you've ever heard a sermon, he kind of is bringing the Bible into it and kind of talking about it, makes love the issue. Great. So you can see these guys are really upfront on their Christianity. Like if the Pilgrims were coming in a general sense of we want to just live on our own. The Puritans, they've got a different agenda going on this. And then he dives into 4 aspects of how love can bind us together as a community. And he kind of lays it all out that the colony is absolutely going to be Christian. We're working together as a group. We're going to improve our lives so we can do even more things for God, meaning expand, become more. And we're going to, again, live out for each other's. And he's really concerned. He says, like the duty of love, we must love brotherly without dissimulation. We must love one another with a pure heart fervently. We must bear one another's burdens. So again, the sense of community. But then he gets to the conclusion with the call to action. And this is the part we really want to focus in. So first, he brings in the words of Micah 6:8. We quoted this in episode 4. So it's something that God had said to his people about what he expects. And so now Winthrop says this is what God expects for us: to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. Then he once again hits the ground for community. Like we're only going to make it if we're knit together. We must delight in each other. We make others' conditions our own. We must rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. I think Dr. King started sounding like he was on some of those right there. And we do all that, next point, with a unity of spirit. And then finally, he lays out this part that becomes really crucial because he says we need to do all these things knowing that God and the world are watching, since, quote, we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. Now, the simplest way to understand that is for him to say, for us to see, he's saying we're going to design a society that could be emulatable. As I just said to you, who does he want to emulate? Well, really wants England. I mean, he broadens it, says the eyes of the world. But he's also, notice he says this, God's watching. So he's trying to say to them, you're not just there trying to pull off something for everybody. I'm calling you to your Christianity, to your claim of faith. And then he warns them. He finishes the sermon by quoting from one of the older books in the Old Testament, the Jewish scripture, Deuteronomy 30, verses 19-20, if somebody wants to look it up, or basically one of the key historical leaders of Israel, Moses, is giving a sermon at that point also. And he ends it and he says, hey, listen, you basically have a choice of life or death in front of you because God's watching. And if you don't obey, Winthrop says, if you don't follow God's ways, we will surely perish out of the good land. So basically what you get here is this sense of a determination to create what they saw as a model society, society that is going to, again, to be emulated. We're not going to make anybody else do it our way, but we would want you to emulate it.
And so basically, and correct me here, but what I'm hearing is not designs to build and expand this massive new thing, but create a positive proof of concept that could be put into action back home.
Yes.
See, that's a whole
it is.
thing.
It is. But I would say if there's any group of our founders that current people would want to say Christian nationalism was our history, it's these guys.
Okay.
These guys would be the ones who are thinking political entity that is Christian.
Yes.
And their structural was such, you had to be a member of the church to vote, you to really do anything in society.
Yeah, so, but that throws the contrast against the other groups.
Right.
Or at least the two we've covered so far.
Exactly. They're the only ones of the 3 we've seen so far that are here. However, there's evidence in the mix about how even their own experience puts us in a place where it didn't work out the way they wanted. It didn't go the way they thought. And so I've mentioned twice already the idea of New England. Now, if you know your geography of North America, you know north and east of New York State, there are, I think it's 6 or 5 small little states. That was not the plan. If you'd ask Winthrop or any of these early founders of Puritans, and you said, one day there's going to be a thing here, what's it going to be called? They'd say, what's it going to be called? New England. There's not going to be small parts of it, but we know that they're all small parts. Well, how'd that happen? What happened because quickly, even amongst the Puritans themselves, you started having other leaders unhappy with how that expression was going on. And so they began pushing back. So the most famous one is Roger Williams. he begins kind of arguing the point that it's what they're doing is too legalistic and not in keeping with the spirit of God. He didn't like the way the Puritans were interfacing with the native peoples. And so he finally says, I'm out. Well, actually, he was banished. So 1635, 5 years later, yeah, you need to leave. So he does. And he goes down and forms his own colony, called it Providence. See the kind of Christian name there if you know it. And that eventually becomes modern-day Rhode Island. And he's followed just 2 years later by another person who was banished, Anne Hutchinson. And she was accused of subverting the truth teachings, and she's also banished, and she founds Portsmouth. So together, they're forming two colonies that later will become Rhode Island. But the fact that it's happening is kind of evidence against the idea that, well, you're going to set up a Christian nation, it's going to be glorious for everybody. Well, apparently not, because and these were all Puritans, so there's nobody not Puritan in. I mean, there are later not Puritans there, but it's within the Puritans themselves, showing, yeah, you can say you want to have a Christian nation that's of a certain specific flavor. Pulling that off is impossible. And the larger history of Christianity demonstrates this, some of which we touched on before. The more narrow history of Christianity post-Reformation certainly indicates this. There's one more, I mean, just for argument's sake, Thomas Hooker in 1636. He thought basically they weren't being pious enough. Okay. And so he's like, y'all are going in the wrong direction. And he ends up going down, I guess, westward along the coastline and establishing Hartford, which basically he establishes Connecticut Path or Bay Path. And long story short, it's the state of Connecticut. So state of Connecticut, state of Rhode Island are evidences against the plausibility or the future potential of a quote-unquote Christian nation. Because as we saw when we looked at Europe and Christendom in general, how are you going to enforce this? Well, you become domineering. You equally become this sense of saying, we're going to kind of force the issue with might makes right. And it's not good. Yeah. You end up with division. They say we're coming for community, and you are banishing people. You have splinter groups forming off. It's not healthy for where they're going. There's a lot of positives in all three of the colonies we've seen so far, and certainly with the Puritans there are too. A lot of wonderful other lessons to include. But I think the fact that we can see early on their push for religious singularity is not a successful path for creating a unified nation at large.
Well, it feels like almost a situation that should have been foreseen. Let's get a giant group of folks who are going to walk if they don't get things their way. Like, okay, well, that should go smoothly, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, they're still those same people.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't like this either. Yes. I'm out. Like,
yeah.
Oh, God, looking back, I should have seen that.
Yeah, yeah. We might have had a different story if of the 1,000 people, you'd had some Catholics and some Anglicans and some Puritans and some bunch of people, and then saw them splinter. But the fact that it's the one group, the one version of the faith itself, it's so telling. All right, you got time for one more?
Yeah, let's get it in, man.
Okay, so this is the one everybody forgets about for lots of reasons, I think. So 1634, so same ballpark. So 1607-08 Jamestown, 1620 Pilgrims, 1629-30 the Puritans, 1634. So again, 1635 is when all that stuff's going down with Williams and Hutchinson, and 36 for Hooker. All right, so 1634, Maryland is founded as a refuge for Catholics. So remind yourself, after Mary, 100 years before, had tried to bring, from her point of view, England back into the fold, didn't go well. She ends up dying tragically, ovarian cancer. It's very sad for her. Catholicism was largely marginalized and to some degree banished and persecuted in England. Of course, Catholicism is just another version of the Christian faith. Obviously, if somebody is a Catholic, they might have a more specific way of saying that, but my way of saying it, it's just one of the ways of people expressing their view of following Jesus. But in England, it wasn't working out. So in 1632, Charles I, so this is the son of James, so it's still one of Queen Elizabeth's cousins, but it's the son of James. He's not a Catholic, but he is married. His wife is Catholic. She's from France. And her name's Mary. But Henrietta Maria is her. There we go. So Charles says, I'm going to give land to one of my nobles, a man named George Calvert, who was known as Lord Baltimore. We'll give him land a little north to the east of where Jamestown is, and the little hook of land that will be on the eastern side of the Chesapeake Bay. So I'm going to give them this land. And Calvert was a Catholic. So he envisioned this being a place for Catholics to leave England, and perhaps to some degree maybe leaving Central Europe if they needed to, but certainly for England, to get away from persecution. So 1634, 2 ships, now we're back to the small numbers again. This is the ships, the Ark and the Dove, made their way, and they'll land on the eastern part of the Chesapeake Bay, and they will establish on March 25th when they land the colony of St. Mary. It's from that obviously the state of Maryland will be formed. If you are from Maryland, you know March 25th is Maryland Day. All right, so the cool part about them not only is then, so 3 of the 4 first colonies, and if you include Rhode Island and Connecticut, then that's 6. So 5 of the 6 represent the Christian theme. If you're pro for the capitalist side, post restoration colonies will pick up a bunch that are all in about the making money. But anyway, so that piece is there. And now you have your 4th version of Christianity on the continent. You have the Anglicans in Jamestown. You have the Separatists in Plymouth. You have the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay. And now you have Catholics in St. Mary's. These guys come. But there weren't as many Catholics as Calvert had hoped. That's the short version. And so what happens is that by the time you fast forward a decade, they're having more people living in and around the colony who are not Catholic. And there begins to be questions for them as to, if I want this to be a sanctuary, a place of refuge for Catholics, how can we make this happen? So under pressure, in April of 1649, so under pressure from the growth and from some growing tension, 1649, that middle section in English history is still happening, which is now to some degree success for the Puritans in England. So there's some fears amongst the Catholics who have moved to St. Mary's. And in fact, it could be arguably said there's already a majority of Anglicans living in the Maryland colony. So the governor and the legislature decides that they want to take this in hand. And so they pass what is the first official Religious Tolerance Act law in world history, certainly in European history. You're still, if you know your European history, 1649, the 30 Years' War is going on. You're at that, 1648 is when it ends, and there has been some statements that have been arguably a statement of some tolerance that is occurring in the European lands. You could also look at some things that happened in France with King Henry IV and Louis XIII that you could maybe argue are religiously tolerant, but in general terms, they weren't what you and I think of a religious tolerance. Open door for everybody, basically, kind of a thing. So what this law does is it doesn't back away from its Christian stance, right? So it starts off by making it still a crime if you blaspheme God or deny Jesus. And they include things in there that are important to Catholics, such as there's a warning if you blaspheme the Virgin Mary. But then it moves into that if you try to attempt to stop a resident about how they worship, or you speak disparagingly about their faith, you could suffer a financial penalty. And if it happened more than once, you could suffer some physical penalty of whipping.
Interesting.
And then the law ends with emphasizing to some degree to avoid those same religious struggles that were occurring in both Europe, the 30 Years' War, and England, as I've already mentioned, that as long as the citizen professes Jesus, then they're free from, here quoting, being in any way troubled, molested, or discountenanced for or in respect of his, her religion, nor in the free exercise thereof. So right out of the gate here, when we say we've got this Christian focus, one of the 2 major themes in the colonies, from our colonial expression, you can see a concern for, if we're going to do something at a larger level in our eventual colonies. And I would say none of these are thinking in any way United Nation or United States later, but they're already that beginning thought process of it's going to be impossible to try to force Christianity on this land or in this government as a quote unquote Christian nation. And we're going to have to open the door for people to have a variety of viewpoints. Now, at this juncture, nobody's saying you're allowed, because they didn't in the Maryland thing, to have a non-Christian viewpoint.
Right.
And that's why I really struggle I try not to say religious freedom, although I did say that with this law, and think in terms of a better way for us in the 21st century to look back is to say they were working for the freedom of Christian expression. It's going to be another century before they really begin to realize, oh, we will have people who have faith positions that are not Christian, and we should include them. And in fact, we'll have people who don't really have any faith, and we need to include them also. We're going to get there. That's in some coming episodes. But the short version here is to say we can see, even as you have 5 of the 6 colonies with the Christian theme forward, as opposed to Jamestown, they're aware, both in what happened in New England and in the idea of how the guys in Plymouth worked together with the non-separatists to be with them to form their government. Here in Maryland, they're going to make it law. They're going to say, we're going to make it a law. You cannot harm somebody or try to stop somebody or even speak disparagingly to someone about their faith. We got to let everybody have their position and their own sense of their own liberty of conscience, we would probably say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to be discountenanced around here. So
yeah,
but yeah, it's interesting that when you say religious tolerance, we immediately have a snapshot, but it's not the right one typically. But it's interesting that there was an evolution,
right,
to it. You know, in this early stage, it's like McFreedom. You're like, you have anything you want at this restaurant: hamburger, cheeseburger, double cheeseburger. You're like, do I have freedom? Yeah.
Yeah, with these choices
from these
only.
options.
Yes.
So again, going back to, you don't have to like it or whatever, but that's how it was. So it's interesting that there was that development.
Yeah. So what we've seen so far, and this is where we're going to end it. We're a little longer today, but that's okay. We have these 2 key themes: capitalism and Christianity. We can see that there's no real thought process for 3 of the 4. There would be for the Puritans of establishing a nation. The Puritans alone also, we could maybe suggest they're doing a Christian nation, but as you noted correctly, their city on a hill is to point back to England in the hopes that this would inspire England's own revival and reform in their senses of doing things. There's a sense of working together. Everybody's thinking in terms of community. We cannot do this apart. We have to be working together. And boy, this could be one of the most important things we could learn in the 21st century. We've lost this deeply, and we need to restore it in your neighborhood, in your groups, get to know your neighbors, this kind of a thing, but they're kind of pulling together in the process. And there is some hint of a civic government of the people. You see that in particular with the Pilgrims, to a lesser degree with the Puritans. Eventually, Jamestown will come around to the same thing. John Smith will not stay in that role for long. Once they've kind of survived the rough season early on, they also begin to establish the idea of their own parliament. So again, voting for the people. But those are kind of these crucial stances that we can take away. So I've said 4 themes. So Christianity, capitalism. The other 2 are risk and rebellion. And so risk shows up in a lot of the other colonies, but in one sense you can see the risk theme in all 4 of the colonies. Massive risk to come. No guarantee of success, right? So it's just like, again, most of us, if we thought about going to Mars, would only want to go after maybe 30 or 40 years of them proving the rockets can get there and get back. They would want to know we could pull that off. And then the rebellion thing, there's other better examples of this later in our colonial history, long before 1776. But you can see it with Hutchinson, Hooker, Williams. They're going to say, look, we don't like what's happening. We're going to kind of push out and start seeing. Those 4 themes are our core 4 themes of, I think, our DNA, I would say, from our colonization. And so they kind of point out to us, to loop it all together, to our friends who are thinking maybe in the 21st century we don't need Christianity at all, maybe it's a negative thing, it's a detriment. Our colonial history says that Christianity is a crucial aspect of where our future founders are going to be looking for that interior spiritual virtue for our common foundation. But for our conservative friends who are thinking, yeah, we were founded as a Christian nation, it's like, yeah, not at all. Not at least not at the colonial level. And we're going to get into the founding, so maybe there's some hope for you. Spoiler alert, there's not. But if you think, oh, there's from the very beginning, it's like, no, not from the very beginning. Were they Christians? Yeah, a lot of them, maybe most of them. But were they establishing a Christian nation? No. And we could learn lessons from them about how they navigated such on the Mayflower, worked with people who did not have the same faith or any faith at all, and see to the negative what happened in New England of when you try to push a faith, you're just causing more division. You're not bringing the community around. And that's kind of the lessons we want to walk away with from our colonial days.
It's fascinating. I can't wait to re-engage this conversation, man. It's laying a cool foundation for where we're going next.
Excellent. All right. I'll see you next time, Matthew.
See ya.
All right.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.